Gina, Lappe, and Kent Dwyer, thank you so much for joining us on Highest Aspirations.
So happy to be here.
Thanks for having us. Excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to have you both. It's actually really fitting, as usual, we have two people on as guests that you both are joining us together. And we'll talk about that in a second. It's all about sort of collaboration here. And I learned about your work through an article in Edutopia called Using ELL Strategies in the Science Classroom. The title caught my attention. That's something that we're doing here at Ellevation, particularly with math, but looking into STEM as well and trying to help teachers work with students in those STEM classes. And we've done some episodes on that. But what really struck me about this article when I got into it was the focus on collaboration between teachers in different areas who have different areas of expertise, which can really obviously make an impact on multilingual learners. It's kind of the gold standard that everybody shoots for. And it's sometimes pretty elusive. So I want to start there. How do a science teacher and a language teacher come together to overcome the challenges that students are facing? Is that something for you both that kind of happened organically? Was it a result of something the school was doing? I know you were at an international school. Tell us a little bit about how it started, and I guess more importantly, kind of how you sustained it, which we'll get into over time.
Yeah, for sure. So we both started at an international school in South Korea the same year. It's a fairly new school, so there were a lot of systems still sort of in the development phases. And my background, I've been teaching science for a number of years, so I came in feeling confident about my skill set as a hands-on inquiry-based science teacher. But when I got to know the student population and just realized the level of kind of language learning needs that existed, with almost 100% of our students taking English or learning it as English in the second language. And so I felt a little overwhelmed by that. I didn't have a lot of experience with that. And so when Kent led a professional development session and sort of showed off kind of what he was available to do at the school, I was instantly really relieved to know that he was there and also really excited to start collaborating with him.
Yes. Go ahead, Kent.
And I saw in Gina a partner from the beginning. I specifically remember after that PD session, she approached me and very clearly and intentionally said, "I'm excited that you're here. I'm excited to partner with you." And I saw a colleague that was both confident and capable enough in her own practice to really reach out and say, "This is an area of growth for me." And I found that very, very exciting. And then when we began to co-plan and co-teach together, her clarity in terms of what was most meaningful for kids in the content area and equally valuing their language acquisition along with content understanding was crucial. She gave me access to all the resources prior to our meetings so that we both came in on the same page. During our co-planning, we were using a UBD approach with language use at the center of it, as well as the content understanding. And then when we would leave these meetings, we had a task list that we would divide up. And that mutual respect and mutual accountability was there from the start, which was great.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like this happens pretty frequently in places where I feel like it's happened to me for sure, where you meet a teacher who is sort of like-minded and you can learn from and you can teach them something as well. And that creates this kind of relationship that is built on trust and mutual understanding and expertise and areas of improvement, areas of growth, as you mentioned, Kent. And what I've noticed in schools that really kind of embrace that culture of collaboration, even if it kind of happens organically because you happen to meet someone who's like-minded, is that it can multiply. It can move kind of spread from one classroom or two classrooms to more. And I remember myself, a lot of the best strategies that I sort of implemented as a teacher came from something that I'd casually talk with somebody about or I'd observe. I'd be walking down a hallway and I'd say, "Oh, that looks cool." And I kind of walk in the classroom because we had that culture at one of the schools I worked at. And the ideas seem to really gain more buy-in and traction that way because it comes from from teachers who are doing the work in the classroom and seeing the positive effect on them. So talk to us a little bit about the effect that your collaboration had on other teachers in your school. And I think we have to like ground this in the idea that you are and Gina, you mentioned 100% of students are learning English, right, in some capacity. And so I think that's a really great kind of microcosm for the people who are listening to this podcast who are thinking about how can we collaborate to help our English learners in schools and maybe have a smaller percentage. So how did that collaboration affect others and kind of multiply?
As an EAL specialist, I noticed that many teachers were really excited to partner with me, but not everyone and not all the time. So what I saw through my partnership with Gina was that she's so respected within our organization that teachers would possibly, from a conversation with her or an observation of what she was doing, get more excited about a strategy, or just see her take on it, or how she had really embedded that into her practice. So they didn't necessarily need to hear it from me, or maybe they did and they didn't really like my take on it or see that transferring to what they were doing day in, day out. But watching another content teacher, especially one as skilled as Gina, was what they needed to say, like, hey, I'd like to do that too. And I specifically remember one PD that we did about fishbowl conversations, and having Gina talk about how using fishbowl conversations in her classroom really shifted assessment practice and then shifted classroom talk. My email blew up after that, and I really saw her role in the PD as much more inspirational than what I could have done just by myself, saying like, this is something I see as cool.
Yeah, and from my side, I felt like I saw over time kind of more people taking me up on those offers, because again, like I said, it was a new school, so didn't really have cultures established, and I was really eager to learn from other colleagues and learn from Kent and the other language faculty, and see what other people were doing, especially because for me this was a new population of students to be working with. And so I was eager to model that by, having a really open door policy in my classroom and sort of talking about what I was doing, seeing what other people were doing, what was working for them. And I saw over time, people started taking me up on those offers more. So I think as they heard about it in more PDs with Kent, and then they actually started coming in, and then they would see it in action and start to see how it might actually work in their content area as well. Because I think sometimes, at least in my experience, you'll hear from someone who's a language specialist or a special education specialist or a trauma-informed education specialist, and that's their whole take. That's their lens. That's their most important thing they're doing. And it can be hard to really think about, well, that's what's most important to you, but I have all these other things that are important to me, and I don't really see how this fits in the limited number of minutes I have with my student, and I can't have all these things be important in the same way. But figuring out how to make them fit within a classroom, I think it really helps for teachers to actually see that in action, and see how these things could translate into a content class. Not to toot my own horn, but I think especially a really content dense class like science, where I feel like sometimes that isn't seen as a space where these things fit, because there's just this perception that there's so much content to cover, and so you can't fit it in. But I was finding the content was irrelevant if I wasn't really meeting my students' needs.
Yeah, in so many ways, content's irrelevant if you're not meeting your students' needs, language being one of them. But what my take from both of what you just said is just it's a mutual respect, right? And it's the fact that you have two teachers who are respected in their own areas of expertise, but also willing, able, and excited to kind of collaborate and learn more. And that gets exciting because everybody knows the teachers who are making an impact, the teachers who the students are excited when they're leaving their classrooms. And if those teachers, that kind of vanguard group, is really working together to implement these kinds of changes, that's, I feel like, how so much of the growth happens. And then it's a matter of leadership, I guess, in most schools, embracing that and saying, okay, how can we leverage these teacher leaders? So it's not just happening in silos. So I think that's great. And again, the context, I was as you were talking, I kept thinking about the context, and I've never worked in an international school. So in a setting like that, I mean, it must spread even quicker because everybody sees, right, the need to make sure that they are incorporating the strategies that Ken is implementing and helping you with, Gina, to work with these students. And I think as the demographic grows, multilingual learners in the United States, and every school, right, almost every teacher in any place now is going to be at some point working with multilingual learners. Hopefully, that trend will continue on a smaller scale in those schools. So I thought that was again kind of like a great little microcosm of sort of what's happening around our country now in schools everywhere. So Kent, you had talked about and shared with me some pretty amazing resources that you created for teachers to use. I want to get a little bit more specific about sort of how the impact that it had and kind of what you have done to make sure that people have access to the information, resources, and strategies that they need. And there's a lot there. I kind of went through it a little bit. You were kind enough to share some stuff with me, but I'd love to hear it from you. Like what how did you go about sharing that? What do those resources do for teachers who want to help their multilingual learners in the way that Gina has done in her classroom? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I had developed at my previous school. I was previously working at an international school before coming to JU. A database of scaffolding techniques. And within this database, I started to house examples and instructional videos and templates of research-based approaches to support language acquisition. And then, as you mentioned, there are a ton of resources in there. So just dumping them into a shared drive and saying, like, good luck finding something that you're going to identify as helpful wasn't going to be an effective approach. So along with the teacher coach at my previous school, we developed an index of the strategies with a short description and a couple examples that link within the shared drive. But then it's a searchable drive, so anything that's a hashtag word within that index, teachers can search. So to answer your question about how teachers can access it, let's say as an example, someone comes in and watches Gina tell an interactive story, and the teacher gets excited about that and says, I want to incorporate that into my practice as well. The teacher can then go to the share drive and search the hashtag term storytelling, and then everything that's connected with that scaffold will appear for that teacher, starting with the description, a short YouTube video, and then multiple examples for the teacher to use. On the other hand, maybe a teacher comes out of a PD and says, Kent mentioned this specific thing that I found interesting. I don't know a ton about it. Well, he or she could then go to the index, read a little bit more about it, and then, again, search that hashtag word and say, okay, I'm comfortable enough to try this independently, or I want to sit down with Ken and talk about it a little bit more in a co-learning session, or, I really need to see this modeled in my classroom to see it in action. So it's really just a way to try to offer multiple entry points for teachers to differentiate their learning just like we do for our kids.
Yeah, that kind of, and the way that you put it, I think is really interesting. Like it's the equivalent of, I guess I'm dating myself here, but when I started teaching, it was like people would leave, packets in the teacher's room, right? Like, and say, we'd have like a foreign language office, and people just there's like a tray to leave something with, here's what I've been using. And you go through this packet. It's like, well, I don't like have the time to go through this entire thing. And I can't, you end up recreating something that somebody had already created. So the idea of indexing and categorizing and being able to search for it. And it seems like you were really deliberate about how you shared that information and how you set it up so that teachers could kind of find what they needed, along with understanding that at least you and Gina, and I imagine probably others, were working together to collaborate on some of these things. So there were living examples. There was kind of evidence that it was working, rather than just now it's, hey, here's a Google folder with everything in it. And I mean, as someone who used to send this to me, and I looked at it, I'm like, I don't even know sort of where to start here, right? But then you sent me another email. Like, oh, this is how you do it. There's index and there's hashtags, and now it made complete sense. So that's great. And that's just really, I feel like, and I'd love to hear your take here, Kent and Gina. That's just a matter of documenting. You're right. You're already creating all this stuff. So taking that next step to kind of make sure that it's searchable and usable by others. I mean, how much of a lift was that for you, honestly, to kind of put that together after you had already created the stuff?
I think it's feasible to do it, and the cost benefit definitely is worth it to take the extra time, because really just including the scaffolds in even the footnotes of your document or in the name of the file is enough for it to pop up in that search. And then particularly in a school with an international school where you might have more turnover just by the nature of the teachers that choose to lead a more nomadic life, housing resources that were proven to work is really important. So we're housing these resources anyway to have something there for alignment and stability within our teaching practice. So then just making it searchable and saying what's the why behind what you're seeing here is not that much extra in terms of time and energy.
Yeah, so much of it has to be just like discipline, right? Being able to say, like, I've created this, I need to take this extra step to do it. And I love what you said about teachers who choose to live a more nomadic lifestyle. And that's kind of another lesson from the international school, right? That I never thought of. I mean, in some schools, you have teachers who stay for their entire careers, but more and more now, it seems that even in schools here in the States, there is turnover there, especially with multilingual, with language teachers. And so creating those things so that they can live on, be shared with others, I think is just best practice. I think the challenge is that many of us don't know how to do that, right? So how do you kind of figure out how to do that, work with it, which I think is probably a conversation for another time, but one that is probably worth having at some point. So let's shift our attention to students here. So teaching STEM courses to multilingual learners, or really anybody, requires mastery of complex academic language, which we talk a lot about here at Ellevation. We've had a lot of guests on to talk about that. So how have you gone about collaborating to ensure that students with a wide variety of language skills, which you do have the language necessary to fully engage in rigorous STEM content, which Gina sounds like is kind of what your main goal is with that inquiry-based model?
Yeah, I think it starts with being really clear about what the most important lever points are around, like in a particular unit, right? What are the high impact vocabulary terms? What are the high impact, like both content and academic terms that you really want to focus on, and allowing yourself to admit and embrace that you're not going to be able to do it all well. And so you really want to focus on those high lever terms and concepts, and then really elevating those as a focal point of the unit. So I think part of it is having a good grasp of your content area such that you can identify those key levers and those big chunks, and then using those as really like the bread and butter of the unit. And I think part of it is also coming with your students to the point where they trust that, yes, there's more to know, right? There's more language to learn, there's more to know, but that you're going to give them those most important pieces. And if they want to learn more, if they're ready to learn more, those are accessible to them. But they trust that what they're getting, the bulk of what they're getting, are really those high impact terms and concepts that can then be, differentiated or scaffolded appropriately for kids. And then finding multiple entry points. So every single student has an opportunity to be successful and contribute. I run like a no opt-out kind of classroom where everyone has something of value to offer every day in class. And be it asking a question, be it making a contribution in your small group, be it, saying you're confused, like really celebrating moments of confusion that are shared. Those kinds of culture building pieces, I think, really also support the language acquisition, because it shows that we're all learning. We're all learning at different paces in different ways. but it's showing up and doing your best and contributing, whatever that looks like on a given day. That's where the value comes. And I think, I mean, you've mentioned this a couple times just in talking about myself and Kent, but I think a lot of our collaboration and the sustaining part of our collaboration came from really identifying those core values about what happens in classrooms, where the value comes in a learning space with students. And having students who are brave, who are taking risks, who are asking questions, that's what's important to me in my classroom. And the content and the vocabulary is a vehicle for us to do that, but that's not really the point. And if that's really clear to the students, I feel like they're more willing to take those risks and to be more successful in the long run, because they know that just showing up and participating is where the value is in class.
So when Gina was mentioning her classroom and having a no opt-out classroom in which students are encouraged to talk about when they're confused or work on those clarification speech acts, it makes me think about how collaborative speech was such a focal point within Gina's classroom and how we really worked to cultivate collaborative speech among students. As part of the warm-ups during instruction, students are constantly working in peers or small groups to make meaning with each other, and they know they're going to be accountable to share with the whole class. Now, for an English language learner, or any student for that matter, that could feel like high pressure if the expectation is, I need to produce the correct answer, right? In quotes. But within Gina's classroom, they know that their questions or paraphrasing another student or just expressing confusion, those are going to be celebrated equally. So students understand that that's valuable. And I really think that speaks to what Gina's talking about in terms of valuing the students first and meeting them where they are. Because yes, the content is super important and we want them to learn and know the skills, but really developing them as people and people that can communicate interpersonally and work interpersonally and collaborate with others is one of those big chunks that can't ever be lost in our classrooms. And we saw it happening, and we saw students taking more risks and expressing more developed thoughts and not necessarily looking to Gina to say, like, is that the right answer? But really building on one another's thoughts, which is what you want to see in a classroom.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Gina.
Sorry. Yeah, just to add to that a little bit, in the climate that we're in, also just the cultural climate in Korea, it's a pretty high demand, high stress academic environment where, correct answers are really the standard that students are looking for. English is a language that is tested. It is not a language that is spoken. And so students aren't really accustomed to just like trying, right? They're accustomed to really feeling this pressure to say it the right way. But in a classroom where over time, and that's really the barrier we're trying to get through in the beginning in my class, is really convincing the students that I really mean it when I say I'm interested in what you have to say. It's okay, whatever it is, right? I want to know if you don't know what's going on. I want to know if you have a question. I want you to find ways to contribute and to be part of this community together. And we all have something to learn from each other. Really, once they come to kind of believe that and see that happening, that's really when those risks start being taken and students start to really grow as people and with their language skills.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that, the sort of culture of language is something that is tested but not spoken, and like that the right answer is the most important piece. I've worked in schools like that, and gaining the students' trust is the most important piece there, right? And which you said. And for those of those people maybe listening and thinking, well, I work in a different school with a different set of challenges, I think that the common denominator is the trust factor. Like if you can get students to open up and to, as you said, celebrate those moments of confusion, which I think is great. And also think more about the long run. Those are the two things that I wrote down, and Kent did a good job sort of synthesizing and adding to what you had originally said, Gina. But you got to be looking at the long run and what we're trying to get out of students, not only this quarter, this year, but for their lives. And if if you can break through that trust barrier, you can do so much. And so while you're in a high pressure situation for one reason, students who are in schools and, you know, any, to pick any district or school in the United States, are facing different challenges where maybe there's a distrust of the educational system, right? For good reason in a lot of cases. Maybe there's a misunderstanding of what the educational system is because students had families who didn't go to school or went to school in a different way. And so that opening up and really thinking about, opening up those pathways by providing an atmosphere of trust. And I think that was something that, not to go on and on this, but something that I was really inspired by last year with the pandemic was that there was so much emphasis put on relationship building. And it wasn't just like, oh yeah, we have to, part of what we have to do. It was like, this is crucial. It's key because we're not even seeing our kids. So I just hope that stays. And thanks for adding your perspective on that, because I think it's really important. And then the other thing is, Kent, you are, oh, sorry, go ahead. Lily, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Just when we're talking about trust, really we have to cultivate that trust among the students as well, because we know they're hyper aware of their social place.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The kids we're teaching are really understanding that they're constantly, in a spot where I'm going to understand that the kids around me are making judgments about who I am as a person. And we know that language constructs our experience. So going back to that idea of that student to student talk, we were really intentional about the frameworks of language and interaction that they were using with each other, because it's hard to put yourself out there and say, Gina, I didn't understand what you said. Can you say it a different way? That's really hard for adults. So to have, a preteen do that, we gave them like an actual way to track their language use with each other. And there are things like eye contact and the murmurs to affirm. And then we practiced over and over. And really, when you can say like, hey, I'm doing this because my teachers are saying it, the risk factor drops immensely. But then that starts to become just a thing you practice, that like fake it till you make it thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you've done it enough in this supported setting where now it just kind of becomes the norm of how they interact. So these students are talking like scientists and like collaborative adults. It's pretty neat to see.
Yeah. And that's like, I'm glad that you mentioned that. But when I began to interrupt you, where I was going with that, Kent, was I think something that is related to this. And I think you and I think Gina and Kent and all of us share an affinity for fitness. At least that's what we were talking about in exercise. I think that you both said that that's something that you also did together when you were abroad. And I so you said something, Kent, the other day that really resonated with me, and hopefully it'll resonate with others. Let's think about others who maybe that's not their passion and hobby. But last time we talked, you used an exercise analogy, Kent, that to describe how students learn academic language. I think it's related to what you just said. Like, you were just talking about how the teacher told me to do something, so I'm going to do it, and it's to take sort of the barriers down. But then I think it kind of becomes muscle memory over time, and they just kind of begin to do things. But that requires sort of discipline. So I love that exercise analogy. So could you just share it with us, because I think it's really quite useful and connected to what you just said.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yeah, as you mentioned, Gina and I coached together and we trained together. And I'm a middle-aged athlete at this point, so warm-ups are becoming more and more important for me.
I can relate.
You don't warm up once for a month of training. You're never going to see results, and you're probably going to get hurt. So with any solid training program or any solid coaching, you have an intentional warm up that you've designed to get your athletes prepared or yourself prepared for the heavy lifting or the intense training. And even the best coaches or the most informed trainers are doing that in a way that starts to blend that warm up and prehab work into your actual physical progress. And then similarly with our students, doing some sort of warm up or front loading really early on in a unit and then kind of forgetting about it for the rest of the time is not going to be effective, right? So embedding that as students walk in the door, they know the routines, particularly when those routines happen across content areas, when they can just see what's displayed on the board or what's sitting on their desk or the dice that are on their table, and they know what's expected without too much instruction. They get right into that warm up and they start owning it, as you said. And that muscle memory is there, and they just know language centers on us. We're going to start using these terms. I know the ways that I can get more support if I need more support, and they get into it and start that warm up.
Yeah, and that reduces cognitive load. And there's all kinds of other analogies we get into in terms of scaling, but still getting the same results and building up to different things. So I thought that was great. Gina, anything to add there? I want to get your take on this, but I also have another question for you because I think there's some specific stuff that I'm interested in chatting with you about as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's a great analogy to think about how to structure education, like long-term, short-term for your class, right? What are your big goals for training, or what's your big competition at the end, and then how are you scaling up to get there? I can't help, I guess, a little bit then put this in there, so we haven't had the chance to talk about it. Just around this piece, this front-loading piece of using digital storytelling in my classroom, which became kind of like a big unit launch component with a really immersive experience of loading a lot of vocabulary early on, but then able to use that as a touch point for those warm-ups throughout the unit. I found that to be like a really transformative piece, kind of bridging over from this language learning domain into a content classroom that really like changed the game for me in terms of how to get a lot of that vocabulary injected early on, and then use these daily engagement strategies to get students to really acquire that vocabulary into their working language.
Yeah, and it sounds like that's based on the framework that we're talking about, and there's a lot of entry points and a lot of different ways to do it. So this is like the perfect comparisons here. We're talking about mind and body here, right? We're talking about muscle memory. And so, Gina, I know one piece that's important for you is supporting students' social emotional needs, which is something that I do not want to leave out of the conversation, especially now. Again, delightfully, there has been a spotlight shown on that as well as relationship building as a result of the pandemic. So perhaps a silver lining that we can work with moving forward. Could you talk with us about some strategies that you use and how they've been implemented to help students get to a place where they can achieve their highest aspirations? I know you mentioned some mindfulness and things like that. So what can we do to help with that?
Yeah, well, I have the gift of a lot of autonomy around how I structure a class period. And I actually start every single class with students sitting in a circle, and we do some sort of structured check-in. So I have a few different sentence frames or few different kind of check-ins we use every week so that students come to know the routine. And those are not content related. Those are just like, how are you feeling today? What's the highlight of your week? Something you're looking forward to. And so every student shares something in that circle. And then we close the circle doing some dynamic mindfulness. So dynamic mindfulness combines action and breathing to help you kind of get centered in your space and ready for whatever it is you're about to do. So students take a few deep breaths. Usually I guide them to find a particular colored item or shape of an item to look at in the room. We take a few deep breaths together, do some motions linked with the breath, like breathing in and raising your arms above your head, and breathing out, bringing them back down. The goal being to get your breaths to be long and sustained and focused. And that takes just a couple minutes, if that. And then we'll transition into the main class session. And I tell students that this is a tool for them to use, in my classroom with me, but it's a tool for them to use in their life. And we talk a little bit kind of about the neuroscience behind telling your body that you're safe. When you're stressed, your body switches into this fight or flight mode. If you're sitting down to a test, you're anxious, a lot of your thinking brain isn't accessible to you, but taking a few deep breaths, re-engages that, tells your body that you're safe, and then allows you to do the task that's in front of you. So by embedding this into class every single day, I'm hopeful that students can take that tool, to help them be successful in my class, but also as a tool that they can use in their life when they're faced with stressful moments or need an opportunity to center themselves. I hope that, I think that I see that students come to know one another pretty well. And in those circles, I'm showing them that I care about them first, right? I'm interested in them. I'm curious about them. I want to know what's going on in their lives. And that's where we're starting a class session from. And then the content and the science part comes after. In those circles, I've learned really intimate things about students that have really helped me to support them better. Students sharing that it's the anniversary of a parent's passing, or students sharing something they're nervous about that's coming up later in the year, or even just talking about tests that are happening. I always know all of the tests that are happening and all of the stressful assignments because students are sharing them in class. So I'm better able to support them, but they're also able to hear from each other that these things are going on, right? So like Kent said, it's not just about me and them, it's about them together. And so how can they support each other, hear that other people are also anxious, hear what's going on for their peers, and really come to be members of a community together. And with the breathing piece as well, again, just showing them that I care about them as people, and here are tools that you can use to be successful that aren't secret, that aren't fancy, but that really do make a difference.
And Gina talked about it earlier. Remember, in our context, it is hyper stressful and hyper achievement focused. We do a capstone project in 5th, 8th, and 12th grade. And this past year, we had multiple groups at the middle school level focusing on student stress levels, anxiety, depression, because they're cognizant of their unhealthy status in an academic environment. So entering into a classroom like Gina's, knowing that they're valued, having the chance to be heard, having the chance to talk about their emotions in a safe space, really kind of set the tone every day that we care about you first.
Yeah, I have to ask this follow-up. I know we're getting to time here, but this is really important. And I'm assuming, first of all, and I'd love to know right away if I'm right, is this not something that's happening in lots of other classes, correct?
No.
Yeah,
No.
so that was my assumption. And so I'm curious, I guess I have children of my own who are, middle school age and younger and older. And so I've seen, and working with students as well in high school. How does this practice begin? How do they react when they're like, we're going to do these breathing exercises, we're going to have this circle? And I guess more importantly, like, how does it adapt over time? Does it become one of those routines that they're all just sort of comfortable doing, or at least they know they're going to do it? Do you have some students who are like, what is this? I don't know. And I mean, I'm just looking for kind of the reality of this, because I totally see the benefit, and I'm definitely playing devil's advocate here. But since you're maybe the only one doing it that way, and it's not like built into the system, I'm just curious, how does that evolve over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. The school I came from before, it was more built into the system. So that's where I came from with my practice. In my previous school, we had the closing circle every day in every classroom. So I knew sort of these things were happening for students in the day. When I came to my current school, I felt unsure about how to create these spaces for students. We do have an advisory program where some of that's happening, but it felt really important to me that I was creating that space with students in my classroom. So I just decided, this is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to stick with the circles I did before. I'm going to stick with the check-ins I did before, and this is how it's going to go. And I think I don't have any hesitation about it, which helps them. I think also students just kind of come to know that if I'm asking them to do something and I'm giving you a why, we're all going to do it. And I understand like what that looks like is really different in different contexts, and it takes a different set of tools, and different students will need you to use a different tool at different times. So for any expectation, you can't just try the same thing over and over and expect it to work for every kid. So you're going to have to be responsive. But I think the at least in this context, some of that group accountability supports it. So there's enough kids who are like willing to do what the teacher is asking, that can kind of help with the momentum. And then the kids who can't handle it, that takes those separate conversations. It takes any other kind of behavior management tool that you have. So initially, it's just what we're doing because kids are nervous and they don't know what's going on, and they're in 6th grade. So they're just going to kind of do it because they're nervous. And then as students kind of try to poke at the boundaries, right? Like, how much can I get away with in this time? It's just being consistent about like, not very much, right? Like, your only job in this moment is to be silent and take a few breaths.
Yeah.
That's your only job. And you're not going to take that opportunity away from anyone else in this room. So
Right.
if you're not going to do the movement, I'll pick my battles on that one. I prefer that everyone do them. That's the goal. But day to day, probably not everyone's going to do them. But here's the line that you're not going to cross, right? And if you're having a hard time meeting that expectation, then that's going to be a separate conversation.
Right. Yeah, I love that. I don't know if there's a right answer to the question I asked, but that's the one that I was hoping I would, just because you did that like accountability. Like, there's a lot, right? It's like anything else. And yeah, I just think it's great. I don't really have anything else to add. If people are interested, to go back 30 seconds and listen again, because I thought that was really, really well said. Kat, you want to say something? Go ahead.
I will say for like transfer for the listeners, like, how's this going to work in my context? I learned a lot from being in Gina's classrooms, and I took what I was seeing her do with her students into that advisory space. So if listeners have something like homeroom or advisory, that was my entry point. And I had 12 8th grade boys. So, I mean, you can imagine,
Easy, right?
Sharing wonderful kids, but like getting them to talk about feelings and highs and lows, and so the structures and the frameworks I was getting from being in Gina's classroom, that was a great spot for me to start practicing it with those boys, and it works. I mean, incredible.
Yeah, there's certainly plenty of research and experience behind it, so that we know it works. Well, I'm glad we spent more time on that than I expected, but I'm glad we did, because I think it's so important now. There's so many of the students that listeners are working with that have experienced trauma in lots of different ways. And I think in some ways now everyone is sort of a newcomer to school this year in one way or another, and everyone is experiencing some sort of change, right? Some significant change to kind of coming back to school. So it's something to think about as we move into this school year. All right. So as we wrap up, I always say that this podcast isn't really like meant to be, PD that you can sort of use right away. It's sort of meant to inspire you to think about the next steps that you can take. But I love to leave people with at least some ideas that they can kind of take the next step on. So what are 2 to 3 things that are relatively easy lifts that you would recommend teachers who are just getting started with this kind of collaborative work, or anything that really we mentioned today? What are 2, 3 things that they can get started with?
Well, first, shameless plug for our article.
Not shameless. It was great.
I think the way that teachers might start it is with the general idea of an understanding about who's doing most of the talking in a classroom. And how to get that baseline data could be as simple as a student with a stopwatch, timing how much you're talking, and then subtracting the total number of classroom minutes. There are online tools, both paid and free, if a teacher wants more data and to go higher tech and to gauge who's doing the communication. But really just getting an understanding about who's talking in your classroom and for how long, from a data-driven point of view. And then from there, saying, how can I bump up the number of minutes students are talking and reduce my talk? Particularly, one of the entry points I thought about was particularly with instructions about how to do things. Students can observe and watch a model and build their understanding. And we know that most of our learners are not going to listen to 5, 7, 10 minutes of instructions about how the game works or what to do in this activity or all the reading strategies you'd like them to use. So I think a really easy entry point, especially with something they've already done before, is really wordless instructions, where the teacher and a student partner model what's happening, or you show a video of what's going to happen with no sound, and students just talk it out. And again, going back to, they talk about what they understand and what questions they have, and then that, no opt-out accountability that Gina mentioned before. Thumbs up, I have an understanding. Hand up, I have a question, and everybody's doing one or the other. And then from there, students are saying what they understand about the activity. You paraphrase it. Thumbs up, I agree. Hand up, I have a question or something to add. Students build their understanding, and then you get to the activity. And that right there just like flips engagement completely, because the students are doing all of the talking. You can assess how much they understand or where the gaps are, and then you get right into it without you talking for 7 minutes and 3 kids hanging on for that period of time.
Yeah. I've been there. I've been down that road many times, and it's such a mindset shift is really mostly what it is. I love the idea, Kent, of the student timer. I love that, because that's showing vulnerability, and it's showing you care, and it's showing, hey, take this watch and tell me how much I'm talking, because I'm concerned that I'm not. I mean, I think that's so great. It shows trust and vulnerability in the teacher there. Gina, anything to add?
Yeah, just to say, I've used that tool before. Actually, a facilitator at a PD I participated in used that tool. She actually gave a timer to a faculty member and set a time limit for herself for the PD. And so I've used that in my classroom, and I've set goals for myself for the week and then kept a running total on the board, which has also built some like anticipation with kids. If you're like getting up to your total and it's not the end of the week, kids get a little like anxious.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun.
Or
It's
want to
cool.
see if you can like beat your time. And then that puts some accountability on them, right? Like, oh, Miss Lappe's out of minutes, so we have to like figure out how to do this thing. Like, she doesn't have any more time to talk. And that, I think, again, like Ken said, kind of shifts the mindset in the room of like, who is really in charge of this space, whose voice is really the point of this space. And it's not mine, right? It's not the teacher's, it's theirs. And so anything you can do to kind of elevate that, I think would be a great strategy for folks to try. In the article, we have a few like launch activities, like starting your class with student talk. And I think that can really also help to shift the tone of the classroom, right? If kids come in, they get themselves ready, and then they're talking using some pretty simple slides, some pretty simple strategies. I think that can also really help make that kind of switch that will help with all these other things we've been talking about.
Yeah, that's great. Those are, and that article, as I said, Kent, that's not a shameless plug. That's how I learned about you. And there are some really great, sort of print resources that you can use there. And we'll link to it in the show notes and in the blog post as well, so folks can access it. Great. All right. Well, as we wrap up here, I have 2 more questions for you. One is, I'd love for people to know how they can learn more, aside from the article, which I'll link to, about the work that you both are doing.
People are welcome to email me if they have questions, or check out my Instagram account. I'm sure those can be linked somewhere, but my Instagram is Lappe_labs. Mostly, yeah, people can get what they want from it. I don't have a significant digital presence for what I'm doing.
Yeah, Gina talks about how that's an area of growth for us, and I love it. It's true.
Yeah.
Kent.Dwyer is my Instagram account. If you go, you might think I'm a PE teacher, because it's mainly pictures of me coaching that my wife's taken during our sessions. I love to coach, so that's a fantastic thing, but maybe not interesting for your listeners. But they can DM me, or they can email me at kentdwyer13@gmail.com, and I would be excited to add them to that share drive. And they can be added so that they can get into that index and kind of poke around in there and see what's helpful. And of course, if it's just this like blob and they say like, I don't really understand how this works, I would love to guide people through it if they want.
Great. We'll really appreciate that. And that resource is very, very thorough. I've poked through it, and I think folks who are working with multilingual learners on a day-to-day basis will definitely find some value from it. And Gina, thank you for providing your information as well. I think that, you know, the work on, I mean, all of it, but the work on mindset and the muscle memory pieces and understanding the importance of warming up and being intentional about front loading. I mean, there's all kinds of valuable information here. And again, like going back to the beginning of our conversation, it comes back to the collaboration between teachers who are like-minded, and skilled in different areas, right? Who are working with one another. And I just think that's the gold standard. And we get busy, we get in our silos, we get, you know, bogged down, and all of a sudden 3 months have gone by and we haven't collaborated with anyone and haven't learned much. And so I think creating those systems is so crucially important. So last question is that you all, I'm sure, have been inspired by different things over the course of your careers. So love to hear if there's a book or film or really any other resource at all that has inspired you either personally or professionally that you'd like to share with listeners.
Sure, yeah, I can share 2 books, both kind of professionally leaning. One is Onward by Christina Aguilar, around building resilience in educators. A lot of that text, for folks who haven't read it, comes back to really identifying your core values as an educator and moving in your life and in your classroom from those core values, which I think came up a number of times in our conversation, but really is what kept this collaboration thriving and helped us both to grow as educators and as friends in our context, is really this alignment of those core values. And then the second one would be a text called Choice Words, which is a book that really helped make some changes in how I use my voice in class in a really meaningful way.
Great. I've heard of Onward, have not read it, but have not heard of Choice Words. That's a new one for me. So thanks.
Really?
Kent, how about you?
Well, I have to second the Choice Words one. Gina and I both independently picked that one, and then saw that during our conversation that we both mentioned that one. It is for anyone who's in a classroom, particularly with language learners, but for anybody, how we speak and how we get students to speak shapes the learning environment. So that's a solid read. And then the next one that I would pick is Fluency Through TPR Storytelling by Blaine Ray and Conti Seeley. You might have like a little subsection of your listeners that are really into CI and storytelling as the vehicle for language acquisition. And that, as Gina alluded to with the digital stories, that approach, that comprehensible input approach, and that storytelling as learning approach has been really formative in the way I interact with language learners. And I just find it so fun, and you really get to see the kids light up with smiles and creativity and using language in the way that we're like naturally attuned to use it.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that recommendation as well. Something I tinkered with a little bit as a language teacher, but never really like explored fully. I think if I had still been doing it, it's something that I probably would have done more of. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And then it was Onward and Choice Words times 2. So I have to put that on my list because I have not heard of that one, which doesn't happen frequently. Having 160 or so episodes now, it seems like I know most of the books that people are going to mention. It's always nice to get a new one. And with that, Kent and Gina, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with both of you. I really appreciate your perspective, appreciate all the work that you've done and that you continue to do. And clearly you're passionate about what you're doing, and you're willing to share your knowledge and your expertise, not only with folks in your schools, but also with random people who are listening to this podcast. So that shows a lot. So thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was great to have the chance to talk.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.